Hope my screen is visible. So we started with the default starter in Spring Boot, and we understand that default starter provides IOC dependencies, AOP, testing dependencies, and log dependencies also. So as IOC dependency is available, we can use all stereotype annotations to create our application, right? And for yeah, so for what purpose this standalone we can use for any standalone applications which are built in single machine. Something a desktop software if you want to build, you can use Spring Boot with the default starter. There you can use all these auto wiring concepts and all. In case if you feel that basic core Java is not enough for you, or if you want to make your application clean, easy maintainable, configurable and all, you can use Spring Boot and you can build standalone or any data processing applications to generate reports from raw data to reports. Anything, right? Such standalones you can implement using basic Spring Boot default start. Now, if you want to build a web application, if you want to build a web or REST or microservices, right? For all these, we have one option. We have one starter is Spring Boot Starter Web. You can use Spring Boot Starter Web. This starter you need to add. When you add this starter, right? When you add this starter along with your default starter, you will get some more capabilities. Web capabilities you will get, REST capabilities you will get, and you can build microservices also using that same REST capabilities. REST, or you may say microservices also you can build. So these capabilities your application will get, or these features your application by default it will get when you add this starter. So it is easy to build any web application or a REST based application when you add Spring Boot Starter Web. Okay, so as every starter providing some default configurations, right? So here what default configurations this Spring Boot Starter Web will provide? What are all the default configurations? What are all by default configurations? What it will provide? Default configurations it will provide dispatcher servlet configuration. Dispatcher servlet is configured. Dispatcher servlet is configured by default, and embedded embedded Tomcat provided. So by default, a dispatcher servlet is configured. If you imagine basic Spring MVC application, there we used to configure dispatcher servlet in web.xml file, just providing some expression to map each of our requests to a central controller or front controller dispatcher servlet. You need not to configure it here. By default, it is configured using URL pattern slash. So which means any request you submit to your application, that will connect to the dispatcher servlet first. Any request you submit, either it is a REST request or a web request, it hits your dispatcher servlet via given embedded Tomcat. This Tomcat given in the form of jar file only. So one Tomcat jar will be available in your dependencies. When you add this Spring Boot starter, this Tomcat jar you will find Tomcat given as a embedded Tomcat in the form of jar. Usually how we work with Tomcat we have downloaded Tomcat, Apache Tomcat, yeah, and here we placed our web projects. In web apps we used to place our web projects and we used to start Tomcat. So a special software need to be downloaded and has to be used. They avoided that dependency. Spring Boot Starter Web came up with the embedded Tomcat, which means you need not to download any special web server to run your web applications. To run web applications before Spring Boot, web applications looks like this in struts or servlets or JSF or Spring MVC. When we build an application using this set of softwares, right, this set of frameworks, we used to deliver web project as a var file. As a var file, we used to deliver it web archive file. .var, student management system .var, employee management system .var. This vars we used to place it into web server like Tomcat. Under web apps folder. We used to place this vars sms.var, ems.var, and we used to start the application. Tomcat server we used to start, then it used to extract your application and it used to read your web.xml file and it used to initialize your servlets and it used to make ready of your application. But when you use a Spring Boot, when you use Spring Boot, when you use Spring Boot, when you use Spring Boot, your application can be a var or jar, sms.var or sms.jar. Okay, you can export your application into two types of configurations, var or jar, and you need not any special Tomcat server to run this. If you have Java runtime environment, that is enough. You can use simple Java command from your command prompt, and you can give -jar, your jar file name or var file name. That's it. It will run. If you start run, it will run. Internally, it will start Tomcat. This var itself contains Tomcat. Inside var or jar itself, it holds container Tomcat. So the default Tomcat is embedded with the Spring Boot Starter web, so that no special software is required even for your production deployments also, right? When you make application or microservices by using Spring Boot in runtime environment, you really not required any Tomcat. Just a Java software is enough. That to JRE, your Java runtime environment. If you have in your runtime environment, like we learned in core Java development is kit required for development, but to run we need a JRE. So just having simple JRE is sufficient to run your Spring Boot application. That's why more people using Spring Boot. So that doesn't require any special set of Tomcat configurations and all. Easily we can run Spring Boot application wherever we want with the required port number while configuring, right? Using server.port we can configure required port number like 9090, whichever you want. Port numbers are allowed from 1 to 65535 maximum port numbers. So you need to identify which are all the free ports you have in that so and so server. That port number you can allocate. So that your application will run on so and so port. Okay. So let me show you how to create it. As you know, right, we have two options. As you know, you have two options to create application. One is by using initializer or by using your STS. Okay. So use Java project type Maven and 3.2 stable version I'm using com.rbu.sh SMS web or SMS as a jar file or var file. You can choose any option here as a var or jar. Okay, and you can add dependencies here. So to work with the web, right, along with your default, if you are not adding any dependency here, default Spring Boot starter will be added. So along with the default Spring Boot starter, if I add Spring Web, okay, remember this. This is for Spring Web. Build web, including RESTful applications using Spring MVC. Uses Apache Tomcat as a default embedded container. Okay, so you can add it, generate it. Okay, one project is generated. SMS web extract your application and import this application into your IDE. Import, use Maven option, existing Maven project, finish it. Okay, why we are generating from initializer is sometimes you may not have this STS ID in your local. If you don't have STS, if you are working on IntelliJ or some other IDs, right? So go and get the project from initializer and import it. Okay. So SMS web is imported. As usual, one main method class generated with @Spring Boot application to scan your classes and to initialize your application context. Okay. In simple words, if anyone asks what is the use of Spring Boot application, you can say Spring Boot application meant for starting IOC container just by loading all the classes using component scan all the classes from same class path or its child packages. Okay, and coming to as you added created web, right, here you see two more folders generated: static, templates. If you have any web pages, if it is a web application, right, we can generate applications like web and REST based applications also. Usually web application will have front end pages also, whereas in REST we don't have any front end. Web will have both front end and back end. Front end, back end. Combination is web application. Front end and back end. Whereas in microservices we have only back end code. We have only back end code in microservices or REST. We don't maintain any front end. Front end will be taken care by another teams using Angular or React, or maybe using different UI technologies, Android or any mobile technology, right? They can invoke your backend services. Just backend code we put. If it is a REST or microservice. If it is a web, we put both front end and backend. So to keep your front end pages, you can use this static and templates. Static maybe you can use for your CSS file, JavaScript files, or if you are using any bootstrap templates, you can keep all that bootstrap files here. And templates folder you should use for your output pages, as we have created some web application before, right? Input page, index page, and success pages. You can keep all such pages into templates in case if it is a web application. Okay, we will explore it more later. Now see the pom.xml where we have the dependency got added. Dependency Spring Boot starter web. Earlier when I created a default project, we saw one Spring Boot starter default, but now it is showing only web, which means by default along with this web, the default starter also being added. Okay, default starter also being added here. This is the default starter. When you include web, it will include both all the default IOC libraries, AOP libraries, testing library, right, and logging library along with your web dependencies. Now, if you explore jar files, what are all jars it added here? Maven dependencies, if you see. Spring Boot starter web, one dependency added. Spring Boot starter, Spring Boot auto configure. We saw all these before also in default. Logback added. We'll see what extra added. JSON libraries also, I think they were available before. One library I can see here, Spring Boot starter Tomcat. Tomcat embedded. Some Tomcat dependencies also added here. Spring Web dependency also added along with your Spring Beans. Something micrometer dependencies, Web MVC dependency, AOP context expression. These all are again context and expressions are from your core libraries. AOP library added, testing library added, Spring Boot test auto configuration, JUnit library, Mojito library. Okay. So what extra I can see here is this embedded Tomcat, Spring Web, Spring MVC, this embedded Tomcat libraries I can see here. Spring Boot starter web, right? So these all are the extra jar files it is added here. Spring MVC, Spring Web, embedded Tomcat dependencies being added along with your core testing, logging, AOP dependencies. Okay. And coming to properties file, just your application name added here. Okay. So it is not really mandatory, but sometimes it may require. You can keep it Spring application name, server dot port. By default, server port is 8080. Server dot port is default 8080. You can see here it will show default. It is 8080, but 8080 is not available in my machine. How do I know that? Maybe I'll ask my friend ChatGPT. Available ports in Windows command. There is a command actually. Yeah, command will display all active connections, listening ports. Try it. See, lot of information given with ports. So maybe you can check what are all ports available. See, 135 port, 445, 1521 port occupied. You know, right? 1521 Arkle occupied it. 3306 MySQL. There are some other ports being occupied. 33060. These all are may be occupied by different softwares that you install in your Windows machine. Every software will have a port number. Okay. So if you consider machine is like a hub in this machine, many softwares being installed, right? Every software needs one port number. That's how operating system will run your software. Okay. Here 8080 also occupied. Maybe Mongo occupied 2701. Like this, so many ports being occupied. Hardly count maybe 100 or 200 ports occupied. So which all ports I can use? Is there any command given to know free ports? Will displays the executable involved in creating. How to know free ports? Oh my god. Something a PowerShell code given to know the free ports. Yeah, but it is sure that available ports are from port number 1 to 65535. Okay. Any port number which is not being used, you can put. Generally, this 90 series, nobody using. If you see here, nobody using 90 series. Okay. Even 80 series also. 8080 is Tomcat is occupied. Apart from that, other ports are free. So 80 ports generally we use in production also, right? Even in our productions. 80 ports you can use 8085 or 8081, 8082 like this. 8080 don't use if you have Arkel already installed. So I'm using 8085 here so that when I start this application, a default embedded Tomcat will be started, run. So server started. Yeah, if you observe here, starting SMS web application, Tomcat initiated, port 8085, starting Tomcat service. So the embedded Tomcat is starting here. So finally Tomcat is started in 8085. That's it. Your application is still running. You can see this is not yet shut down. Until unless you shut down it, it will not go down. So easily you can implement web application or REST based application. No much infrastructure required. Just create a web project with the Spring Boot Starter web dependency. That's it. By default, your dispatcher servlet configuration also will be provided here. Maybe if you can explore these jar files, all the default configurations you can see. Okay, Spring Boot Starter web, you have web dependency here, right? Spring MVC, lot of jar files given. Some AOT factories configured, runtime, HTTP. If you explore, you can find something web fragmentation, servlet, container initialization. You have to explore. Okay, when you are doing project means explore all the defaults, how it is providing, what internal it is doing. right? That's how if you explore, you will understand more about it. Web application initializer. So all default classes being implemented here to start your dispatcher servlet. Okay. Anyway, so if I keep it aside, apart from Tomcat, we have other options also here. You can exclude Tomcat and you can use other embedded servers. Okay, you can configure other embedded servers here apart from Tomcat also. Okay, let me show you that. Okay, so if you open this POM file, right? Yeah. So if you see this dependency, web dependency, Spring Boot starter web added, and you need to exclude default this starter web coming up with this starter Tomcat also, right? You can exclude this using this exclude options so that Tomcat will be excluded from your default. So go to your web project. Here you can exclude it. So now Tomcat is excluded. Tomcat is excluded. Shut down and try to start it. Same application if I try to run, as this Tomcat is excluded, it cannot able to use Tomcat here. Start it. Yeah, application C, it went down. The reason, started web application in 3 seconds. It is saying started web application, but there is no Tomcat. So obviously, it cannot able to handle your web or REST project. It needs a web server. As you excluded your web server, it cannot able to initialize dispatcher servlet, and it cannot able to provide web services to you. So when you exclude it, you need to include some other dependency here. I excluded Tomcat. Okay, what else you want? We have other options like Jetty and under Tau. You can add the dependencies. Spring Boot supporting Spring Boot starter Jetty is available. You can add. This is like your Tomcat only, a web dependency. Okay, just added Jetty. If you have application server, if they are providing embedded support, you can add it. I don't believe applications provide embedded support. You need to make it as a var file, okay, without any, yeah. So without any Tomcat, you need to make it as a var. As usual, you should place it via your DevOps, or you need to place it in your directory, application server directory. There you need to start like your traditional web application, traditional servlet application only. You should handle that. Okay. If it is like a Lambda functions or Azure functions, okay. So how many ways we have means we can make our application as uh, a function. By using functions we can implement Lambda functions or Azure functions. So for them we can use embedded Tomcat, or else you can use embedded Tomcat in your Linux environment, or anywhere in your cluster, um, in your EC2, or if you are using Kubernetes cluster, there also you can use this embedded Tomcat. No issues with this. In case if you have something application servers like JBoss, WebLogic, WebSphere, okay, maybe in such scenario you need to place this application into their directories and you should start that application server. Okay. Yeah, but this is pretty much enough having embedded server for microservices. Okay. It can handle any kind of request, but yeah, it's all depends on your application data. And yeah, so Jetty also started, if you see earlier we started Tomcat, now embedded Jetty is starting. So started server, Jetty started on port 8085. So this application also still continuously running, Jetty also running. Okay. So you can use Jetty also for your web application or REST application. And we have one more option under tau. You can add this under tau dependency. You can comment this Jetty dependency, and you can use under tau dependency. You can use under tau dependency. Shut down. Correct. Spring Boot. Yeah. Spring Boot only provided them, if you observe. Spring Boot, as part of Spring Boot starters only, they are available. Okay. There are three options they given, but Spring Boot itself default considered Tomcat is best for them. Almost they, the threshold, or when you observe the performance, right? They are mostly same. So you can go with the Tomcat, which is proven, right? So you can use that. So Undertow also started in port number 8085. Okay. So in case, yeah, Undertow belongs to JBoss, maybe. Yeah. So if you want to try different flavors, you can try them. Okay. You can try them just by configuring this dependency. But you need not to write any code much here. Just add, exclude first Tomcat dependency and add the extra dependency like Jetty or Undertow. So it will start accordingly on the same port number. Okay. So the final conclusion is here: when you create a Spring Boot starter web project, you need not to have any special infrastructure to run this project. Just Java runtime environment is enough. Just JRE is enough to run your application. Just JRE is enough. Let me show you. Okay, this is your web project. If you build it, finally it generates. Generally, this is how in production it will work. Maven build we perform. We or CI/CD will perform this clean install. We perform this clean install. Finally, it generates. Maven will do all the build. It will get all the libraries. It will do all the compilation. It will execute all the test cases. Once everything it felt well, it's okay, everything looks good, it will generate one jar file. One jar it will generate. Okay. So this jar got generated. You can run that jar directly on Java runtime environment. Java version. It is using 9x. On 9, I don't think we can run 17 implementation. So for that, what I will do, I will run directly it on 17 version only. Let me copy SMS jar file. This is my jar. If I have only one runtime environment, 17 will be available, but I have so many jars. Let me go to Java installation directory, Java 17. You need not to do this. If you have Java 17 directly, you can run. Okay. So here if I check Java hyphen version, as I am in that current directory, it is showing Java 17 only. Okay. So now comfortably I can run jar. The jar file name is SMS web jar. See, Spring Boot application is getting started. It is saying is 8080 is already in use, which means in IDE already we are running it, right? Are we running it? No. Maybe some other port listening it. How I can correct it? Do I need to go to my code and correct it? Means really not required. Here also you can configure runtime arguments after jar hyphen hyphen server dot same property name you need to use. Port is equal to 9090. Started application. Undertow now started in port 9090. Okay. So these are runtime configurations. We will discuss about it. Okay. We can pass properties. Yeah, correct. So default one 858085 it is. Why? Because they given this property means during coding you may use so many ports, but in production sometimes there are so many multiple nodes or multiple clusters you may want to run. Okay, same application you may want to run it into different ports. It is not possible, right, in production going into your file and doing code changes. That is not even legal also. They can't extract your jar and change your code. So you know configurations are really important to change sometimes when you switch one environment to another environment. So they given these arguments options to you to override the existing properties. Okay, so that's how I'm overriding this property, existing 8085 overriding with 9090. In Spring we never use this command prompt such stuff, right? We generally deploy it into Tomcat. In Spring we don't have this option. Okay, in Spring we don't have this option, but command line arguments you can use using Java, right? We learned it while running core Java. Hmm. Yeah, correct. Yeah, so in Spring we don't have, obviously we don't have this provision. So as this application designed like a main method application for convenience, right? For our convenience this application is looking like a core Java application, but as and when you start this, internally it is doing lot. Your main method application is going to start a Tomcat and this application becoming a web application. But for you, it is looking like a simple core Java main method. But internal, what it is doing, when you start this application internally, it is starting IOC. Along with IOC, now it is starting your Tomcat also. Earlier, we learned that it will start IOC, not only IOC, now it is starting your Tomcat also. It starts Tomcat also. It will start Tomcat, it will start your IOC both. And a default configuration, default dispatcher servlet, will initialize. Correct all the spellings, okay? Yeah. So by default, it will initialize your Tomcat. By default, it will initialize your dispatcher servlet along with your IOC. Okay. So you need not to worry how to make it as a var file, how to run it. You need not to rush into all that as a jar file. Run it anywhere. You have Linux server, EC2 machine, or Kubernetes cluster anywhere. Use this simple command. It will start your application on your required port, so that you can publish that uh, particular mission IP. That is a different story. Okay, to get it from outside the world via World Wide Web, anybody can access your IP and your port, and they can access your application if you provision that. Okay, yeah. So default web starter is providing what? Embedded servers. It is providing default Tomcat. It is providing default configuration, dispatcher servlet configured, and by default embedded Tomcat also provided with the server port number 8080. Server dot port is 8080. This is default for your web application. Okay. So as I said, you can build both web and REST based applications also. Yeah. So if you want to explore to this web application, okay, already I have shown you Bootify, right? Bootify based example. Maybe which is the one which we generated in Bootify, I believe this one, right? So if you see this application, some static files added here and some template files also added here, like error.html, layout.html, some student folder, home folder for index.html. How they are working, if you want, right? If you go to your controller, right, you will understand that home controller how it is working. If I start with home controller, the basic web application, right? Basic web application using at the rate controller. If it is a web application, we go with the controller annotation. We can use all stereotypes, all other stuff. When you use Spring Boot, only for web, only for web when you use, only for web when you use this, only for web when you use this, you can use controller annotation. You can use controller annotation. In REST based, this controller is not required. Okay. In REST, you can go with at the rate REST controller. You can use this controller. So you can use this controller annotation, and you can use all the remaining stereotypes, all IOC annotations. You can use all IOC annotations. You can use, okay, all features from IOC you can use, and you can use embedded Tomcat also. All the default configurations you can use embedded Tomcat. You can use, okay, everything you can use. But when you use Spring Boot for when you use Spring Boot for microservices, when you use Spring Boot for microservices, we will use at the rate REST controller. At the rate REST controller with all other options. We can use all other options here at the rate REST controller with all IOC. We can use all IOC annotations, and embedded also you can use embedded Tomcat you can use. The only difference is REST controller will provide, it will enable REST capabilities, whereas controller will enable web capabilities. In interviews, usually you will hear a question like, what is the difference between At the rate controller and rest controller, I heard many times people were telling that the only difference is at the rate response body uh, not required, or at the rate request body not required. Maybe that is not a straightforward answer. Instead, you can explain them. Controllers we use for web applications, right? A traditional web, if you want to build, you can go with at the rate controller to make your application rest enabled. Rest in the sense, anybody should able to call your applications if they are allowed from any front end machine or any front end application. They should able to make a call to your machine. They need not to be in a same machine. Whereas in web application, your front end client will be front end client code, or front end code will be merged with your back end code, or both will be together like your Spring MVC code. But whereas in microservices, you will have only back end code you will have here, and this back end code can be invoked by any client, any mobile client, any UI client, Angular or React, any client, any HTML, basic jQuery or JavaScript, any front end client or any Java client also. There is another Java application or a .NET application or a Python application or PHP application, anything. Any code that wanted to invoke your backend code, they can call. They can make a call from their machine to, or their front end device to your backend code. They can make a call to your backend code via REST. Via REST. REST is a common, via HTTP protocol only we exchange the information. So via HTTP only they will make a call, and your special REST controllers, right? They will respond to them. They will take request and they will give response. We'll discuss in detail about it. Okay. Yeah. Tomorrow we will see one web application. Okay. We will see one web application end to end. Maybe I'll give a use case. Then we will see one microservice, a simple application. Microservices not yet started, right? I'll give one simple REST application. Okay. Then we will proceed ahead for other modules. Yeah. No, no, we are not at there. Mhm. Do you have any emergency to learn that? Because we have to see so many flavors. MySQL are. See, I have discussed Bootify, right? Have you seen that session? That video yesterday I uploaded. If you are not seeing in the portal, go to YouTube. Directly access our folder. Okay. Here you go to YouTube. Okay. So here you can, maybe if you not at seen, I am showing you playlist. Okay. Let me show you playlist. Okay, if you go to this playlist, right, the recent one, January 24th, there one 15 minutes video I uploaded. uh, okay, yeah, all videos are up to date here. This one 15 session 27. I will keep this into portal also today, but you can go here. I clearly explained how to generate application using Bootify. So this is the Bootify special web software given to generate applications. End to end it will generate. I given one example using Hibernate. Uh, there, instead of Hibernate, you can use NoSQL also if you want. Okay, it will generate code end to end. You need not to do anything. Just you need to go to your properties file. Just you have to add your username, passwords, database stuff here. Here. Okay. If you change your data source URL, username, passwords, it will function. End-to-end application it will generate. Okay, you can explore it. But for us, still we have time. Tomorrow, once I conclude with this web module, right, I will start JDBC. Then we will see JPA. In JPA, I'll show you SQL integration. Later, I'll show you NoSQL with Mongo template integrations. Okay, Mongo repositories available. We will use them. Okay, yeah, that is on the way. Okay, anyway, we are not going to skip anything. Those are high priority to us. Okay, yeah. Sorry, tomorrow not possible. Uh, if possible, evening we can connect, but I don't think we are going to a temple. Sunday we will connect. Sunday we will spend good time. Okay, 2 3 hours we will spend. Uh, just we will play with them. Okay, how to use controller. We will make some sample web applications. Okay, end-to-end applications we'll try to do with the knowledge what we learned so far. Okay, uh, yeah, so that you will get some confidence on that module. Yeah, Sunday mostly evening. Okay, so until Sunday evening you can plan 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock. We'll plan. I'll post you by Sunday morning. Yeah, yeah. Okay, yeah. I hope that's it for today. Okay, connect you on Sunday session.